Welcome to our virtual class for global citizenship. I am your professor, Nicholas Woodward, and today we're lucky to have Toby Miller here with us. Toby Miller is a very well-known interdisciplinary social scientist with several books published, and he is now working in conjunction with Tecnológica University in the laboratory. Toby, thank you so much for coming.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Nick, and a great pleasure to be here at the Tecnológica. And of course, nice and easy for me to be speaking in my native tongue of English. It's a privilege.
It's always fun to be able to express oneself in your native language, for sure.
Well, one of the things we're talking about today is the idea of citizenship, and often language and accent become quite crucial parts of citizenship, don't they?
It's a good point. I mean, you've actually kind of united these two concepts, citizenship and culture. A lot of your work centers on this idea of cultural citizenship. And right before the video, we were kind of talking about the question of who came up with this concept, whether it was your original concept or if you developed it in conjunction with other people. So can you tell us a little bit about the history of this idea of cultural citizenship and what it means exactly?
Well, if you think about a concept like reggaeton, it has a similarly complex genealogy. You can say it's from Panama, you can say it's from Jamaica, you can say it's from Colombia, you can say it's from Puerto Rico, you can say it's from the Bronx in New York City, all sorts of different histories because different components of it come to light at different times. And I think there's probably a similar life story to cultural citizenship. It's certainly a concept I've been using for decades, but many other people have been doing the same, and I don't know what came first. A very prominent and important instance in the case of Latin America is the work of Renato Rosaldo, who is a Chicano and Jewish scholar and anthropologist from the United States, who coined it to describe the way in which expatriate Latin Americans living in the US, whether they be Mexican or not, many of whom were sin papeles, didn't have visas or other forms of legitimacy, sought to make claims on the state nonetheless, alongside people who did have papeles, who did have passports or visas that allowed them to be there. As probably people know, Puerto Ricans, for example, are US citizens, so they were always already legitimately there. And this was partly about the idea of language. So attempts to ensure that in schools, in the big Spanish-speaking parts of the United States, obviously the most important are New York and Los Angeles, but plenty of other parts of the country too, children would have the right to learn Spanish at school if that was part of their cultural upbringing. And also that folks who had come to the country as adults and didn't speak English would have services made available to them in Spanish. So this was an attempt to bring together the idea of citizenship as something that is an entitlement and a right that derives from where you live with the reality of the United States being one of the biggest Spanish-speaking countries in the world. But so many of the people from Latin America living there doing so without papers or on limited term visas, rather than having the conventional rights of political citizens.
So cultural citizenship, more than anything, has to do with immigrant communities living in a country that's different from the country of their birth.
That's a really big part of it, but so are things like indigenous rights or First Peoples rights. In the case of the so-called white settler colonies, places like New Zealand, Aotearoa, Canada, the United States, Australia, where major imperial powers, France and Britain, moved in, but unlike in the Spanish model, basically cleared away all indigenous people as a deliberate policy. Here it was done by the Spanish partly deliberately, but a lot through disease, as you know, through imported diseases from Europe that accidentally came with them and engaged in the other half of the genocide, if you like. But the British and French model was to bring vast numbers of their own people to these countries and populate them. And so you get white-dominated societies that are not mestizo in the same way that people say these are. And those countries have special debts to indigenous people who were dispossessed, and in the case of the United States in particular, special debts to enslaved people who were brought from Africa, just as is the case here on the coast. So it's partly about rights for people who move to another country where perhaps their language or their customs, their dress, their form of being is different from the norm. But it's also about acknowledging the horrendous history of colonialism and imperialism that lives on today, and the need for reparations for those affected by it, whether they be original landowners or whether they be the enslaved who were brought against their will to these places.
It's interesting that you're highlighting countries like the United States, Britain, Australia, as examples of places where cultural citizenship plays a major role in combining people from different cultures into one sense of belonging, I suppose. How does this concept play out in Colombia? Do you think that cultural citizenship exists in Colombia? And if it does, what are its manifestations?
Well, the idea derives in many ways from multiculturalism, which was coined in the United States in the pre-Second World War period to describe what was seen as a successful ethnic melting pot. And these sorts of metaphors were used, not that dissimilar to mestizaje in some ways, to describe how white people had prospered by being able to move up the class ladder, regardless of their class origins, regardless of their language, by being able to create a new amalgam of personhood, a new way of being an American that drew on some of their past. Now, what's different in Latin America is that here people more commonly speak of interculturalism, interculturalidad, more than they speak of multiculturalismo, which they see as being a US invention. I think that's fair to say.
I could agree.
So interculturalidad, as I understand it, is more based on the idea of mestizaje being the fundamental base of this world, but also trying to acknowledge the specificity, particularly in Colombia, of three very important groups, namely Afro-descended Colombians, campesinos, and indigenous people. And as you and others have shown me, it's very important in this context to realize that all these three groups have special land rights claims. So it seems to me that when it comes to land, which is as important as language in the way people identify themselves and how they communicate, on the one hand, we have a set of laws and a constitution here in Colombia that are very progressive. But echa la ley, echa la trampa. The law is one thing, the lived reality is another. So yes, there are all kinds of motherhood, or what we call in the United States apple pie statements about citizenship and culture. But how do they play out on the ground? It doesn't seem to me, but you know much more than I do, and so do the students. It doesn't seem to me that the full exercise of the three kinds of citizenship rights, political, economic, and cultural, are equally available to all people in Colombia. By the political, I mean the right to reside and the right to vote. By the economic, I mean the right to survive and thrive, to prosper. And by the cultural, I mean the right to communication. So, for instance, if you were to have full-throated, fully fledged cultural citizenship in Colombia, you'd want to see a national television network for campesinos. You'd probably want 2 or 3 for indigenous peoples, and you'd want one for Afro-descended peoples. Not fairly isolated community radio networks, but serious national networks of television presenting the news, the current affairs, the sports, the drama, the documentaries made by those groups so that they can communicate with one another and so that others can learn more about them, and all those things supported by the state. That's what full exercise of cultural citizenship would involve here in Colombia. But I'd be interested to know whether you think I'm right in saying that not all groups have equal access to those entitlements and rights.
Toby, the way that you describe neoliberalism sounds very much like a change in economic citizenship, right? After World War II, economic citizenship was very much based on the idea of the public, people sharing goods, holding things in common. And then after 1973, it sounds like you're describing a process in which the public, or the idea of the public, was kind of destroyed. And the new focus was on individual actors, private interests. When we talk about cultural citizenship and the process of neoliberalism, it seems that what has happened is kind of the opposite. Neoliberalism has actually increased a people's ability to express themselves and who they are. Everybody has their own means of communication now. They have their own Facebook page, their own Twitter feed, etc. Do you think that neoliberalism has increased people's ability to practice their cultural citizenship?
I think one of the key elements that happens after 73 is that more and more first world or global north countries that had specialized in manufacturing send that offshore to take advantage of cheaper wage rates. So cars and TV sets are not made in Britain anymore, or not very much. And an example would be today the television set, where they're all made in Mexico, Vietnam, and China. Almost nowhere else makes any television sets whatsoever. Instead of jobs, therefore, in factories for blue-collar or working-class men and women, as had been the case for decades, there is a new policy of deindustrialization that emphasizes the services sector. The services sector includes education, insurance, finance, banking, culture, the arts, so on. So Hollywood, movie industries more generally, drama, television, popular music become key elements, along with all their associated bits in terms of law, for example, of the economies of these places. So suddenly culture, which once had been in some way outside the economy and not terribly important, becomes utterly central. This means you get more and more investment flying into culture and the attempt to make more business opportunities out of it. The internet is a classic example. The internet was created with US government money and with some European government money as a means of creating a decentralized form of communication that Soviet rocket attacks and China rocket attacks would be unable to knock out. That's the packet system as we know it. This was then handed over to the private sector to do with as it wished. In the same way as when you look at your cell phone and you are impressed by all the things it can do and how it can be individuated to meet your needs. In fact, almost all the core components were created with government money, with state funding, but then handed over. And so there is this, on the one hand, massive state support for cultural and communications activities. On the other, the neoliberal desire to get out of that industry. So private capital comes in and takes advantage of these things, right? So Facebook is based on what had been for decades a popular yearbook that you got in physical material form at Harvard University as an incoming freshman, your first year of study, which showed you the pictures, the headshots of all the other freshmen, so you could work out who looked cute. Perhaps ask them out on a date, look for them at a party, find out a bit about them. That's what Facebook was, and then they turned it into a money-making venture. Now, that might sound all very innocent and good, and in fact handing over the reins of self-expression to the public. The trouble is that Facebook is a business. It makes money by governing and commodifying your activities. So does Twitter. So every time that you or I on our page say, I love UTB, or I love the Beatles, or I think that Maluma is a monster because he's sexist, or whatever it is we say, that market intelligence is fed back to all the economic interests connected with it, along with information about us. And that means, for example, that if you're applying for a job with a big multinational corporation or a major government entity, or you're seeking admission to a university, they have teams of people who go back and read everything you ever put up on Twitter, everything you ever put up on Facebook. They get a profile of your consuming interests. They also get a profile of you behaving oddly at parties, falling over, kicking someone's head at football, expressing extremist positions, whatever it might be. So, yes, you can see the apotheosis of neoliberalism in the emphasis on culture and communication economically, and in pushing out into the public for our own use, free, materials that were initially created with government funding and then turned into money-making properties by private corporations. On the other hand, you can see this as a means of gathering massive amounts of intelligence, knowledge about us, and not just what we like to buy or how we like to dress, but what we believe in and what our lives have been like, that might be hidden on our hoja de vida, our resume. Yeah? So, yes, these are forms of expressing ourselves, and they can be very satisfying and important. Today's my birthday. I was very pleased when lots of people, many of whom I've never heard of, wrote to me and said happy birthday on Facebook. But I know that all of that is part of a profiling exercise in which they and I are tools in the hands of Facebook, Google, Twitter, WhatsApp, YouTube, and all these other companies, many of which are themselves linked, and of course which then can be infiltrated by governments, as we saw with the way in which the Russian government, through various private sector organizations, influenced the last presidential election in the United States and influenced the vote for Britain to leave the European Union.
When you talk about cultural citizenship, you very much talk about two sides, right? There's the ability to express oneself. There's also the ability to receive information and then act based on that information, right? You talk about cultural citizenship in terms of, for example, news broadcasts, and how the media has a responsibility to keep the public informed, interested, and moved by the things that their government's doing. And you criticize very strongly U.S. media companies in their failure to do so. There's this idea that the U.S. public is very much uninformed, unmoved, and not very interested in what their government's doing, especially in terms of what the government's doing against other people in other countries. Yes. How does this dynamic play out in Colombia? Do you feel that the same failure is evident in Colombian media companies? And do you think that these new technologies that a lot of people feel hold a lot of promise for making media a little bit more democratic actually do hold the promise of keeping people more informed and interested in what their government does?
Let me start with the second one, because I've been talking in very pessimistic terms, very negative, economistic ones. And I think it's important to talk about the positives as well, and to see how in many parts of the world, including Colombia, groups traditionally excluded from control of things like television and radio production, who might be objects of a news story but not subjects, might not be the people behind the camera or being journalists covering stories, they might be the objects of those stories, how those groups have picked up very well on the possibilities offered by the internet. I'm thinking of campesinos, indigenous people, and Afro-descended Colombians, who, in addition to having their own vibrant performance culture of everyday interaction, human interaction, are also people who make radio programs and television programs and films and documentaries, and now have more opportunity to connect with one another and with other audiences through that. In addition, of course, we have seen the ability of indigenous peoples in many parts of the world to connect and create a notion of a first peoples consciousness, which includes Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Australia, Canada, lots of places, who find they have a great deal in common in terms of their experiences of dispossession and their desire to use these new technologies in order to connect. The problem is that many times the new technologies require significant investment. Not so much, say, in a smartphone, but in the bandwidth that allows you to connect via the smartphone around the world or even around Colombia with high quality video that does justice to what you've been filming, whether this is a conversation such as our own today, or whether it's a feature film. So you need infrastructure in place to permit this talented uptake by marginal groups of these new technologies. To give a very quick example, the attempts to help preserve and develop indigenous minority languages here in Colombia through the media just don't have proper investment to carry along the creativity of the people involved. By contrast with an example would be Welsh, which is a minority language in Britain. Britain is made up, as many of you will know, of different countries. The country of the Welsh was called Wales, Gales, was the first victim of the English Empire, what became the British Empire, and language was suppressed, but has come back. But with the assertion of cultural citizenship rights, you get proper government funding to assist not only in education in that language, but in ensuring that it is broadcast very effectively through all sorts of media. That's what we need now, for example, for the palanqueros. You know? Now, on the first issue you raised, which was about the responsibility of the broadcast media, it is still the case that very large numbers of Colombians get their news from RCN and Caracol, sometimes TV, sometimes radio, but a lot from television. I am currently a resident, very proudly, of Colombia, but I'm not a citizen, and I don't have the length of attachment and knowledge that you and our audience share. However, I am very troubled by the narrowness of the coverage and by the way in which I don't think it says enough about other parts of Latin America. I don't think it says enough about the different social strata of Colombia, an immensely complex country. And I don't see enough people who are television anchors, you know, the people who are reading the news, or television reporters who represent the Colombia that I see on the street. I think it's very, very important that that be changed. But not just those people who are on camera, those who are behind the camera, those who are making the choices about the stories. We need a lot more serious, but also enjoyable, joyous as well as grave, light as well as profound reporting on working class people and the minority groups that we've discussed. Otherwise, you feel as though you're getting a light-skinned Colombian perspective again and again. And one of the reasons why that happens is a reliance on advertising, when so many advertising agencies are driven by a light-skinned aesthetic and preference that they both carry on themselves and deliver to broadcasters, and also derive from the marketing fantasies of the companies that wish to be promoted. To get beyond that, you need, on the one hand, to have proper public investment, and on the other, to have production put into the hands of communities. And then you're going to get a mix of news that will really be driven by the public interest.
Very interesting. I think that there's one socio-cultural phenomenon where we can see a lot of these different elements of your interests coming together, and that's the migration crises that we're seeing in the United States and in Colombia right now. We can see them come together because we're talking about issues of citizenship, who's recognized as a citizen, who can participate in elections, who have economic rights to participate in the economy, and who can express themselves over the means of communication. We're going to watch 3 videos in our class. One is by an American media company called Vox Media, where they're talking about Colombia's reception of Venezuelan immigrants, migrants. And another is by RCN, where they're covering the same phenomenon, but they have kind of a different way of talking about it, a way of expressing it. Toby, talk a little bit about these 2 videos. How are they similar? How are they different?
Well, it's very important to realize that they're trying to do different things because they're generically different. They're corporately different, and they're nationally different. What do I mean by that? Well, they're generically different in that RCN is providing a nightly news story, right? Where nothing's supposed to last more than 2 or 3 minutes, where a lot of background knowledge on the part of the audience is assumed, because you're talking about your own country and its intersections with Venezuela, where there isn't a great deal of context given, and where you're seeing, yes, some vox pops, voice of the people, vox populi in the original Latin, but you're having a reporter talking straight to camera through the medium of a discussion with the anchor back at her desk. In the case of Vox, you've got a much longer story. It's more than twice the length. You've got someone who is assuming no knowledge on the part of the audience, because this is part of a long series, or longish series, of stories about flashpoints for immigration around the world, who is not from the country but he is in. He's a gringo who is in Colombia talking to Colombians and Venezuelans, who is giving a lot more context and is starting from the basics. Ironically, I think you get not only a basic level of instruction from Vox, by contrast with the broadcast medium version, but you also get a more humane set of stories. The irony is you get a better sense of the pain people are suffering, but also the giving that's being done. But both stories, I think, are effective. One telling the tale of the tragedy of a Colombian woman returning after living most of her life in Venezuela, leaving 2 of her children behind because her infant is struggling with malnutrition and disease, enormously affecting. The other one is more of a story of hope, in that though you're given the data and the maps that explain the situation, you also get to see people talking about the kind of caring and love that they've received. If they were Colombians who had to go to Venezuela at the height of the conflict, or Venezuelans coming now. At the same time, of course, there are tensions, there are difficulties, no one would deny that. But I think that you get a more profound understanding of the problem as an outsider from Vox. You get a sympathetic retelling of a familiar story from RCN.
So let's flip it now. We've seen a video of an American media company reporting on a situation in Colombia. But of course, we also have Colombian media commenting on situations in the United States. For example, the situation of Latin American migration into the United States. So Toby, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in this video.
Well, it's interesting in that the footage was shot by the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, which is a very important private non-government organization, part of civil society, that tries to protect the freedoms of everybody within the United States, be they citizens or not. And the ACLU, as it is called by its acronym, has been very active in chronicling the horrors that are being experienced by mostly Central Americans who are migrating into the southwestern United States through Mexico. They're mostly not Mexicans at the moment, but they're people who've come through Mexico, who are fleeing, frankly, the horrors of Honduras and El Salvador, where, as everybody knows, violence is at epidemic levels, in part because of corrupt governments enabled by you-know-who, the United States. So the ACLU has shot this footage. Now, if you were watching this in, say, Britain, the BBC or ITV, the big TV news companies, or Sky, would not accept this. They would not take footage handed to them by the ACLU. They would want their own reporters to have taken the footage. But okay, RCN accepted it, and it's good that it did. This is a spectacular attempt to reach at the heartstrings, and it certainly affected me, as I imagine it will have touched the hearts of many here, to see an infant unable to recognize its own mother as a consequence of the separations engendered not only by the Donald J. Trump administration, but before that by the Barack Hussein Obama the third administration. Many, 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 many more expulsions of Latin Americans from the United States under Obama than under Trump. But of course, it's a big political story now. And this tale, to me, on the one hand, buys into anti-US sentiment that many people in Latin America have, for understandable and good reasons, as a consequence of things like the Monroe Doctrine from 2 centuries ago, which basically told the British and the French to stay out of Latin America, it's our backyard, and which has animated much US foreign policy in the region ever since. It's what animates Plan Colombia, for example. Understandable annoyance at that, and the cultural influence of Hollywood in both television and film. But also a sense that the United States, in its current incarnation, lacks both humility and grandeur. And if you lack humility and grandeur, two great qualities that I associate with the United States at its best, then you're left with the third quality I associate with the United States, which is horror, which is the horror of dispossession of native peoples, the horror of slavery, the horror of terrible wars around the world. And to me, this is a very effective emotional tug at the heartstrings based on both traditional ambivalence towards the United States on the part of Colombians and also a particular antipathy about the current administration's emphasis on horror over humility and grandeur.
If you were a Colombian student, you're watching these news broadcasts, you're feeling moved to take action, you're upset and scandalized by what's happening, but you also don't feel like you have a lot of power to change it. It's what's happening up in the United States. It's a problem of the gringos, right? How do these new notions of cultural citizenship that have kind of woken up under neoliberalism, how do they allow people to participate in a more global sense of their citizenship?
Well, I think that's happening with the open-handed and open-hearted attitude of some, not all, but many Colombians to Venezuelans fleeing the socio-economic, political, potentially military horrors of their homeland. But what would need to happen here would be, I think, multi-pronged. Because of language, because of a shared history, to connect with the peoples of El Salvador and Honduras, also others not immediately involved, the very poor countries like Haiti and La República Dominicana, but in particular Honduras and El Salvador. Press representatives of our government here in Colombia to get the Organization of American States more involved in human rights issues in El Salvador and in Honduras, to get the OAS to criticize the Trump administration more, but to do what I did in my 20 years living in the US. I'm now a US citizen, but I wasn't born there and I didn't grow up there. Tell me what you think of this. If you flatter people from the United States, not individually but collectively, by telling them what an incredible inspiration the US is in terms of the ideals of modernity, in terms of a chance for all, in terms of a rhetoric of diversity. Let's not undermine the heritage of civil rights for African Americans, for women, for queer people, and how that's expanded and exploded all over the world from one place. Let's not forget that. So humor them, make them feel important, and then tell them that they've let themselves down by their own standards. So on the one hand, I would say, identify with fellow Latin Americans, Hispanohablantes, in Central America, who are suffering unimaginable privation and horror, and push your government to call for more human rights for those people. And then on the other, use your own points of connection. The internet is a great way of doing this. Not just to wag fingers in the faces of gringos. Guess what? Big story, they don't care. But to say, this is what we thought you stood for. were we so wrong?
Toby, thank you so much for talking with us and for this interview. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Nicholas.